Hello, and welcome to Poetry at the Dalí. I'm Hank Hine, the museum director, and it's my honor to introduce the curator of this program, Helen Pruitt Wallace. Helen Pruitt Wallace is the Poet Laureate of St. Petersburg, and we are delighted that today we will have a Poet Laureate of Georgia together with John Brehm reading from their poems. We're very appreciative of the support of the city of St. Petersburg, and we have created a tradition in our program in which our host, Helen Pruitt Wallace, begins before introducing the guest poets, begins with a poem of her own. So, Helen, will you take it away?
I will. Thank you, Hank. Thanks as always for your support of the program, and to the Dalí Museum, which has been supporting this program now for the poetry program for 4 to 5 years, I think. And we really appreciate all the staff. A lot of effort goes into making this happen. So thanks to all of you there at the museum for helping us with this. And thanks especially to Chelsea and John for joining us this evening. And those of you who are not able to watch it at our normal time, which will be Thursday from 6 to 7:30. You're welcome to watch it at any point because the program will still be on our Dalí YouTube channel. So, and yes, thank you to the city of St. Petersburg also for sponsoring our program. And of course, to those of you tuning in. So I'm going to read one poem. This is an attempt at a ghazal. And so you'll hear, in this form, you'll hear the repetition of words at the end of lines. Ghazal for the vanishing handshake. Each day is a pocket with a hole. The loose hours fall through what can't be held. By evening, I've lost myself. Even our hands feel gagged. A backpack you pass on a bench, sours for days in rain. Whatever sorrows it holds, we can't touch them with our hands. Can you remember the salty smell of skin, that power of longing leaning closer? What's stronger than the language of our hands? Or maybe it's only what they translate. Touch a mother tongue the whole world craves, that contact humming through our hands. But a wren's distant song still touched me. Who am I to let myself go missing? Our fig tree drops leaves when it needs water. Our hands fall to our sides. But look, each one still has 5 fingers, and veins flush the cells that feed the splintered lifelines of our hands. Why keep them like trapped birds in our pockets, walled as we are 6 feet apart? We measure space by heart and not our hands. A backpack, a bird and falling leaves, a glazed web broken by wind. Maybe we're lucky, so much is out of our hands. It's fun to try different forms, and that one is interesting to me, but anyway, that's a pretty early draft. I am especially excited to have Chelsea and John with us, and I want to start by introducing Chelsea. She'll read first, and then we'll have John's reading, and then, as usual, we'll have our Q&A. So Chelsea Rathburn is the author of 3 full-length poetry collections, most recently Still Life with Mother and Knife, a New York Times new and noteworthy book published by Louisiana State University Press in 2019. A beautiful book. Congratulations, Chelsea, on this book. Her individual poems have appeared in Poetry, the Atlantic Monthly, the New Republic, the Southern Review, New England Review, and Ploughshares, among others. In 2009, she received Poetry Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. She's born and raised in Florida. And she now lives in Macon, Georgia, where she teaches at Mercer University. Since 2019, she served as the Poet Laureate of Georgia. Welcome, Chelsea. So happy to have you here. And, so I knew you a little bit, right? Back in grad school. And I think you were an undergrad at that point.
It was, yes.
Yeah.
It's been a long time.
Been a long time. But then, we've seen each other off and on throughout. So it's really nice to have you join us. We appreciate it. And looking forward to your reading. So.
Well, thank you, Helen. Thank you so much. And thanks to Hank and the Dalí. I'm really happy. I've followed this series from afar and always hoped that I would be able to, either to participate as a reader or participate as an audience member. I frequently make the drive from Georgia down to South Florida, where my family still lives. So given the museum setting, I wanted to read, I'm going to read all poems from my most recent book, Still Life with Mother and Knife. And that's a book that deals largely with art, with artists and models. It also deals a lot with the female body and with girlhood and motherhood. And I suppose a lot of other things thrown in there. But I think I'm going to focus mostly on a little bit of childhood, motherhood, and the arts. So the book opens with an epigraph from the psychologist Bruno Bettelheim. His book, The Uses of Enchantment, which is, if you don't know it, it's a wonderful book. Bettelheim is advocating for reading fairy tales to children, but not the Disneyfied versions, the really dark, grim ones. And so this is a quote from that book. He says, "The child wonders who or what projects him into adversity, and what can prevent this from happening to him. Are there benevolent powers in addition to his parents? Are his parents benevolent powers?" So this first poem in the collection speaks a little bit to that question. It's called Postpartum, a Fairy Tale. The pages of our storybook childhoods were ripped from the Brothers Grimm. The woods always in shadow, the apples poisoned, the ladders made of bone. Our mothers telling us early how much they loved and loathed us, how my aunt had wished to find my cousin drowned in the washing machine, while my mother hoped her cat would climb the walls of my crib and steal my breath. Our longed for endings told gleefully and in the passive voice. Those days were gone, they told us, but we wondered. If, as Bettelheim writes, the witches and giants and the brutal fairy tales are really stand-ins for the parents the child is afraid to fear and love, what did we make of our mother's revelations, which made us the monstrous creatures, changelings left by trolls? That they could not or would not save us, that we had to learn to walk the woods alone. And the first section of the book, every poem the title begins introduction to something. And so there's introduction to home economics, introduction to sex education, introduction to desire, and so on. I'm going to read two of those. This one is called Introduction to Captivity. And the primary setting is a plant nursery that used to be in Miami on US 1 called Green Thumb Nursery. And they were notable in my mind. I hated going there, but there was a caged monkey at the back of this plant nursery. So Introduction to Captivity. The days we wandered the drugstore aisles, my cousin and I, counting out coins for makeup we were too young to wear, all of them gone. The drugstore too, and the tropical nursery where our parents dragged us despite the heat, and the caged capuchin who sat scowling in that nursery. While our parents wove through towering rows of palms, we crouched beside the cage to watch the monkey eat the grit he pulled from his nose. We threw pebbles into the cage, and he ate them too, and reached for the pennies I flashed at him. My cousin waved her lipstick next, a purple only an 8-year-old could love, and he scrambled for the tube. Does a monkey smeared in frosted orchid look that much worse than a child does? At my cousin's wails, our parents came running to find the monkey, lips aglow, shaking a purpled fist in rage or consolation through the bars. Gone, those lush and potted plants. Gone, our burning girlhoods, yearning to be older, to be prettier, to be anyone else. It was lucky, they told us, laughing. He didn't bite. So the next poem I'll read from that section of the book, it's called Introduction to Art History. And I cheat a little bit in this poem because it's really 3 poems in one. There's 3 sections, and I struggled for a long time when I was writing this book, as you'll hear later. I worked on a sequence of poems that were directly in conversation with the work of Eugene Delaqua, and so I wanted, as I was putting the collection together, I knew that I wanted a poem about art history itself, introduction to art history, and I kept trying and failing and trying and failing to write that poem. And trying all of these different directions, I finally said, "Oh, I can group these multiple poems under this one heading." That's what I did. So two of the sections begin with the title of a work of art, and the first one is Fountain, 1917. So that is Dada artist Marcel Duchamp's urinal, right? The ready-made urinal where Duchamp just signed it Armut. So. 1, Fountain, 1917. In the half dark we sat, most of us half awake, as Miss Bagwell rocked on thin heels, clicking through slides on an ancient projector, tracing our progress from the walls of caves through fertile and faceless Venus of Willendorf to the ancient Greeks' golden boys and gods. Having signed up for the gentle impressionists whose prints hung on our kitchen calendar, I suffered through the Rococo and David. I was suspicious of the French romantics' tumult and restraint, the exaggerated tension in those bodies splayed across battlegrounds and rafts, and all the women bare-chested for no apparent reason. But by the spring, I decided I loved it all, even what I hadn't liked, especially the way Miss Bagwell nearly leaped out of her shoes at her favorite slides, her hands flying, breathless as she tried to tell us everything she knew before the bell. Even when I couldn't see what she saw in a square of flat black paint or a porcelain urinal, I wanted to be, without embarrassment or irony, transformed by what I loved. And the second section is an imaginary art history lecture. So if you can imagine kind of clicking through a slideshow or PowerPoint, if I am in the contemporary age, PowerPoint as I go. So this is number 2, a brief history of women's art. This woman artist, who was classically trained, posed for great men. Her face is in your book. This woman artist quit when her husband complained. This one was famous for the lovers she took. This woman artist married a painter, a genius, and put aside her work for his career. This woman artist did not paint with his penis. This one, if her work had left the domestic sphere, could have been good. This one married and had 3 children and loved them. This woman artist went mad. And then the third and final section of the poem is called The Birth of Venus, which I think is a painting everyone knows. The artists, my friends, and I imagined ourselves as we skulked through the halls of high school, a thrift store battalion in our black shirts and mismatched coats. We're nothing like the sculptor I met in college, who paid me $8 an hour to stretch naked on a sunroom couch and let myself be sketched. Older, but not by much, she could have stepped from the frame of a Botticelli. Blonde curls, nearly transparent skin, but more surprising than her beauty was how she radiated happiness, which should have been art's antidote. And I looked nothing like the women splayed across art through the ages, my body narrow, small-breasted, nothing like those virgin mothers, bathers, and concubines, all of them busty and glowing, all of them inviting or avoiding the viewer's eye. Who was to be my model? I, who never knew exactly where to look or what to do with all my grief and anger, or where to put my restless hands. So I was writing these poems about girlhood shortly after having a baby. And I had a severe, I laugh about it now, it was terrible. But I had a severe case of postpartum depression. And I was writing these poems thinking a lot about dangers, childhood dangers, kind of the dangers of being a girl on the cusp of womanhood. And also thinking about a lot about the stories I had heard about the postpartum experience. As you heard in the opening poem, my female relatives used to talk very openly about these violent postpartum fantasies that they had, and my experience wasn't like that at all. It was different. It was much more inward turned, very dark. And so I wrote a number of poems about my pregnancy, about the early months of motherhood. I tend not to read those because they're some of them quite dark. But what ended up helping me, I was teaching a literature class on it was early world literature, and I had a theme of vengeance. And so I was teaching the play Euripides' tragedy Medea. And I came across one day making lecture notes, as one does, PowerPoint slides and things. I came across Eugene Delaqua's painting of Medea. And for some reason, this painting just spoke to me. And I couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand what the attraction was to the painting. And so when I don't understand something, what I do is I write a poem about it normally, trying to understand, what is this? What is this here? And so the one poem turned into a number of poems, more and more poems. I ended up in France, in the back rooms of a museum, sitting with boxes of Delaqua's sketches. He had made about 30 sketches, preparatory sketches for this painting. So this is a poem that kind of, I guess, struggles to. It just begins by describing the painting itself, but then also is kind of interrogating maybe my connection to it. So the title is the title of Delacroix's painting. So it's Medea Furious, 1838. Furious Medea, Delacroix called her. But I can see no rage unless we count her breasts, twin weapons pointing fiercely at us, or the hand clenching a dagger, its shadow slicing her nearest child's leg. There is disorder in her hair and robes, but her face, caught in profile, reveals what we might read as sadness, a jaw too soft for anger. The painting's tension lies in its lack of fury, in the illusion that she might be guarding the boys, in our knowledge that she is not. And the children in her arms, they know it too. The one half hugged, half throttled, squirms away. The other is folded in a pose so close to the surrender of nursing, he seems at peace almost, but for his eye, open wide and looking directly at us. How many times have I seen that look? The flash of fear on my young daughter's face when I have raged at her or some small thing. It passes, the fury and the terror. My daughter puts on socks, the driver yields, but I'm left shaken, a stranger. Maybe all mothers murder their children's innocence. In the painting, Medea holds her boys so close, they're one body again, two cords she must cut. The children have no choice but to love the hand that holds the knife. I'll read another poem from that, one or two more from that sequence. This is called The Swimmer. In the drawings, it takes a while for Delacroix to settle on the children's resignation as their mother marches them through a grotto toward death. On canvas, their bodies will be limp, even their squirms submissive. But in the center of one sketch, the larger child, he must be 5 or 6, not much older than my daughter, has thrown one arm over Medea's shoulder, as though he'd fight her off or plead for love. I think of that gesture, how fierce and futile, as I stand shoulder deep in pool water, days before my daughter learns to swim. Her formal lessons forgotten, she grips my shoulder the way the sketched boy clutches the mother who holds the knife, as if I want to drown her, so she has to kill me first. She's thrashing, wild against the cage of my arms, holding on as she pushes away, whimpering, now screaming. The boy's arm is slender and straining, muscled as a swimmer's, and I can't decide if my daughter's right not to trust me, I who once cast her from my body, who threaten and cajole, who would, in fact, dunk her before she's ready. Soon she'll learn to trust her body's buoyancy and slide beneath the surface, unafraid. But now she claws at me, pushing me under, as though my arms weren't keeping her afloat. And then concluding the Delaqua section, I came across this really interesting passage in a book called Bodies of Art, French Literary Realism and the Artist's Model. The book is by Marie Lathers. And this quote is, "In his youth, Delaqua had many sessions with female models devoted to activities other than posing." I just love it. It's so euphemistic. So this is a poem called Lay Figures. And it's about artist models, but also about those little wooden, artist figures that can be posed that people can sketch from, lay figures. I hadn't thought about those little men in years, the wooden models cased in glass at the art supply store, though I'd linger by them after school, studying their blank faces and jointed limbs, wondering what they were for and who would buy them. Surprising then, to find their forms again in Delaqua's sketches, to recognize in a master's hand the long O's of their faces and torsos. In one series, two mannequins instead of men lean into the mouth of a cave in the briefest of outlines, while robed Medea is a maze of angles and her dagger seems to tremble. Why wouldn't the great artist rough out ideas by posing figures who'd stay where they were put? Of course, he might have drawn real men. What do I know? Artists' habits. But at a recent auction, a mannequin d'Adelaide sold from his studio, and I was delighted to think that I was right about the way he worked. He sketched live models too, and bedded many, but always finished from the imagination, unconstrained by the living features of man or girl. The figure in the auction catalog was spindlier than the ones I once admired, its knobby elbows and fingers more expressive somehow, though its face just as empty. The way the artist must have thought of the real girls too, mute and posable, interchangeable even, another set of tools. And I think I'll close with what I think was a more cheerful poem, since I've read a couple of very dark poems about my daughter. This is called In the Shower. My daughter studies my naked form. Her hair shampooed and rinsed, her eyes safe now to open. My daughter gazes on my body while I fight the urge to turn away. How hard it is to be held in the eyes of another. I used to pose for artists. Hopeful one might find me beautiful and teach me how. But as they sketched, I looked out the window or over their heads, afraid to meet their eyes or see myself as I'd been rendered. They weren't looking at me exactly, but at shapes and shadows, at intersecting planes, and invention in an invented room. My daughter looks more closely than a painter. She rubs my ruined belly, pokes my hips, soaping my knees with her small hands. She studies me the way I've stood before a work of art, examining those diaphanous bathers or some Dutch still life, lemons and fish on a platter, the ordinary gleaming, or the way I stand and watch her as she sleeps. Thank you.
Oh. Wow, that was wonderful. That was
Thank you so much.
Gosh, how old is your daughter now?
She turned 9 about a week and a half ago.
Yeah, so many powerful poems, and it's really great to hear you read them. I've enjoyed your book before, and just reading the poems myself, I still feel the power of your striking imagery, but hearing you read them is just really terrific. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have John Brehm. Has published 3 books of poetry, most recently No Day at the Beach from the University of Wisconsin Press. He's the editor of the Poetry of Impermanence, Mindfulness, and Joy, and the author of a book of essays, The Dharma of Poetry, which I happen to have right here, just released by Wisdom Publications. His poems have appeared in Poetry, the Southern Review, the Gettysburg Review, The Sun, Best American Poetry, the Writer's Almanac, and many other journals and anthologies. He lives in Portland, Oregon, and teaches poetry and meditation classes at Portland and in Denver, Colorado. So welcome, John. So happy that you could join us.
Thank you, Helen. Yes, I'm delighted to be here. So thank you so much for the invitation, and thanks to Hank and everyone at the Dalí for making this series possible. It's really wonderful to be a part of such an illustrious poetry series. And thank you, Chelsea, for the reading. That was just terrific. It's so beautiful to the poems about paintings, to be immersed in the visual field of the images of the paintings and the sounds and rhythms of poems. All that happening together is quite wonderful. So I'm going to begin with a poem from this anthology that Helen mentioned, and the Poetry of Impermanence, Mindfulness, and Joy. And this is a poem by the 12th century Japanese poet and monk Saigyo. And this is a waka, so it's a 5-line poem. And you should know, since you can't see the poem, the first word of the poem is detached, and that is in quotation marks. And I wanted to read this because I feel like it kind of speaks to the theme of self and other. Detached observer of blossoms finds himself in time intimate with them. So when they separate from the branch, it's he who falls deeply into grief. And I'll read now a couple poems from my latest book, No Day at the Beach. And the first poem I'll read is called Dick's Kitchen, Metaphysical. And Dick's Kitchen is kind of a hip burger joint here in Portland. And I started this poem while I was there, and this was not long after the 2016 election. And it references a book that I'm reading at Dick's Kitchen, and that book is by Rudolf Steiner, the esoteric philosopher and Goethe scholar. Dick's Kitchen, Metaphysical. When I set aside the book about knowledge of higher worlds and how to attain it, dog-earing the passage that explains why the initiate must listen without judgment to whatever is being said, however contrary or noxious it might be, the waitress at Dick's Kitchen asked me if I'm still working on everything. And I answer yes, because I'm not only lingering over my turkey burger and sweet yam knot fries, but pondering questions of life and death and how to access the mystical realm that shimmers like a heat mirage at the center of all things. But when she further inquires if my food is still tasting well, I feel myself plummeting back into the lower worlds, where all I do is silently correct my fellow human beings for the way they dress or drive or speak or think, peppering them with sarcastic questions or barking at them in my head like a full-blown crazy person. How could you vote for that apoplectic, orange-faced, racist ignoramus? Or, oh, for the love of Christ, yes, you can turn right on red. That's been a rule for about 40 years. I guess they forgot to tell you. But then I remember the section on patience, forbearance, and non-anger, which I had been tempted to skip, that says, every symptom of impatience produces a paralyzing effect on the higher faculties. And suddenly I see them, my higher faculties, frozen like statues in attitudes of agony and strife, like Rodin's prisoners or Michelangelo's slaves, wisdom languishing in chains, compassion with downcast eyes, kindness struggling to rise from the stone.
Nice.
And now I'm going to read the title poem from the book, No Day at the Beach. And I often use dialogue in my poems, and some of my poems are just kind of straight transcriptions of actual conversations. And this is one of those. It's just a conversation that turned into a poem. No Day at the Beach. It's no day at the beach being me, I said. It's no walk in the park. I can see that, she said. Trust me, I said, it's no picnic. Clearly, she said. What's that supposed to mean? I said. I'm just agreeing with you, she said. You might have argued a bit, I said. Tried to convince me otherwise. Who knows? Maybe it is a day at the beach being me. Or maybe it's a day at the beach being with me. No, she said, it's not. And I'm going to read some newer poems now, and then I'll come back to the book a little bit later. And the first poem I'll read of this newer group is called Morning Dilemma. And I find as I get older that my poems are increasingly about just whatever I happen to observe out my window. And it's usually nothing very dramatic. And in a way, I find that more fruitful. Although I envy, well, in some ways, my friend Heather Sellers, who I know many of you know, but she writes these just amazing poems about these extraordinary things that take place in her front yard or in her garden, like watching an egret swallow a lizard, or when the rains come and the flood, her streets flood, watching people kayak down her street, or cars float up onto her lawn. These quite remarkable, dramatic things. Nothing like that ever happens around here. Anyway, this is called Morning Dilemma. Awake at 4 this morning. Why, I'm not sure. Outside, it's dark and rainy. Nothing's visible beyond a few sketchy trees, a white fluorescent streetlight 1 block over, like a chunk of moon lodged in winter branches. A day to stay inside and read a novel about almost human robots. Thank God for novelists. Old age would be insupportable without them. Meditate, read novels, write poems now and then, stare out the window, love my wife. That's my plan for growing old, my ambition. A ladybug walked across my desk a few minutes ago. Do they fly around in the cold rain of December? I considered sliding a piece of paper under it, opening the window and flicking it into the outer darkness, like a word flying off a page, but wondered if it might prefer to stay inside where it's warm and dry. And in any case, I would have had to dislodge my cat from my lap, and she had 1 foreleg draped over her eyes as if the world were already too much to bear, which it is. And while I was struggling with that decision, the ladybug moved itself out of my field of vision, eliminating the problem without solving it. Such was the morning's drama and dilemma. Darkness outside, a visitor from the insect world, isolated sharp light illuminating a chalice of stripped branches, a man with a cat on his lap considering it all. Who's to say we weren't a single being in that moment, a moment of miraculous consciousness spread across, bestowed upon, arising from these things I have seen and named and briefly touch with my mind before the day begins. This next poem is called Metta, and it's M-E-T-T-A, and Metta is it's a Pali word, and Pali is the ancient Indian language of the Buddhist sutras. And it translates as loving kindness, but also suggests benevolence, friendliness or kind of goodwill towards others. It also refers to a particular Buddhist meditation practice. Metta. The book I'm reading suggests we send loving kindness to everyone we see, silently addressing them thus: may you be well, may you be safe, may you be happy. And I do this for a while, sitting inside a cafe, watching the foot traffic go by. It feels good, generous, loving, kind. But after a time, I start modifying the blessing. May you be well, may you be safe, may you be happy, and maybe also lose the frowning into the phone facial expression I get so tired of seeing everywhere I go. It's the shadow side of loving kindness, sticking its nose in, having it say, and I can't seem to shut it up. Someone else walks by and I offer, may you be well, may you be safe, may you be happy. And while you're at it, how about some nicer clothes? It wouldn't kill you to dress with a bit more panache, would it? I keep on in this way, dishing out blessings with a side of helpful advice, until I notice across the room 2 young women talking quietly, sitting side by side. They both seem healthy, attractive, nicely dressed, in no need of either my blessings or my corrective commentary. But then I see that one of them is crying, nodding her head when her friend says something, wiping tears from her cheeks with the palms of her hands. She pulls it together for a while, but then her face clenches and she gives in until her friend lays a hand on her shoulder and she can talk again, a gentle rhythm of crying and talking. Waves rising and falling. It doesn't look like she's been visited by tragedy, a sudden death or shattering diagnosis. Ordinary heartbreak would be my guess, the shock of betrayal, some painful reversal in the endless cycle of loss and gain. And now a new emptiness spreads out before her and she doesn't know what to do. But what kills me is when she tucks her hair behind her ear and tries not to cry and fails, overcome by this sadness, so that I feel it too. A great swell lifts and carries me and almost pulls me under. And then I'm in the thick of it, wishing her to be well, to be safe, to be happy, as if my life depended on it. I'm going to read a couple of shorter poems. This poem's called Wishful Thinking, and it's a poem about anxiety and just the proliferation of anxious thoughts that we all suffer from to one degree or another. Wishful thinking. I wish I could lift my brain from my skull, rest it in a bowl of cool water, watch the steam rise, listen to it sizzle, the poor, reckless, overheated thing, always worrying, always wanting. I would bathe it in sea salt and lavender, rose oil and eucalyptus, cradle it against my chest like a child, this thing crazed and crafted by 5 million years of fear, the lions that stalked us on the African savannas, now internalized. In its place would be a space where nothing could happen, an attic room with pitched ceilings and dormer windows looking out on falling snow, elm trees etched into a metallic winter sky, absolute silence. A dream house, warm enclosure in cold clarity, sailing into the wind, no one at the helm. This next poem is called Wanting, Not Wanting. And I notice that it also begins with a wish. Wanting, not wanting. I wish I didn't want things to be other than they are, but wanting to be someone who doesn't want things to be other than they are is just another way of wanting things to be other than they are. And I don't want that. This next poem is quite short. It's, I think, the shortest poem I've ever written. It's just 2 lines and just 6 words. So I I love reading and writing short poems. And my own short poems have been very strongly influenced by my teacher, A.R. Ammons, who, in addition to writing book-length poems, wrote very, very short poems. And he has a wonderful book that I would recommend to all of you called The Really Short Poems of A.R. Ammons. And they are indeed really short. And some of them are quite pithy, and some are very funny. And I'll just share one with you. And some of you may know this. It's also a 2-line poem. It's called Their Sex Life. One failure on top of another. So I just want to acknowledge my debt to Archie, who's a wonderful teacher and a wonderful poet. And this book is quite terrific. And this poem is called On Turning 64. The slowing down is speeding up. And I'll read a few more short poems. I like to write in a particular sort of self-created form of very short lines, 2-line stanzas, and each line containing just 1 or 2 or at most 3 words. So there's a lot of space. And for those of you who like to see what poems look, I don't know if that shows up, or maybe the light's not right. Anyway, oh, there it is. Anyway. If you want to have a sense of it, but I like kind of moving through this open space in the poem. This is called Design. Strung between rose bushes, lit with late afternoon light, this spider web pushed and pulled by the breeze, breathing, it seems, and knowing just how much to give in either direction without breaking. An exemplary figure, perfectly designed to catch and hold small insects, this sunlight, my fluttering attention. And I'll read a couple more short poems from No Day at the Beach. And let's see. This first poem is one that I wrote when I lived in New York City. It's called Etiquette. Here in New York City, smiling is frowned upon, and looking up, looked down upon. And another short poem. I get a lot of poetic mileage out of kind of making fun of myself. And this is a poem of that nature. It's called Genius Offshore. Standing in the ocean calm for a long while, when 3 big ones lift me up, knock me down, and I realize even the waves come in waves. This next poem is a newer poem and a longer poem. And I don't write a lot of poems about childhood experience anymore. But I was struck, Chelsea, by something you said when you were introducing one of your poems. You said, when I don't understand something, I write a poem about it. And there's a particular set of memories around a particular boy who I went to grade school with that kind of kept sort of haunting me. And, you know, I had a sense of why, but I felt like exploring that more just to see what was there. So this poem is about this boy, and it's called Dudley Ball. In 3rd grade, only 2 kids got chased around the playground. One was a shaggy-haired boy, I think his name was Peter, who miraculously appeared in Lincoln, Nebraska from England in 1963, trailing clouds of Beatlemania. I watched in helpless amazement as the girls squealed and took off after him at every recess. Hard to imagine what they would have done had they caught him, held him down and kissed him, torn him limb from limb like the Maenads in Ovid. The other was Dudley Ball, whose yellowish face and bloodshot eyes I now know indicated jaundice and liver disease, but at the time signified only strangeness, laughable ugliness, untouchable difference from the rest of us. The other boys chased him, threw kickballs at him, thrilled you could zing a ball at a weird kid named Dudley Ball. Hey, Dudley, have a ball. Dudley Ball, what a dud. The red hair and freckles, puffy cheeks, and constant perspiration amplified his otherness. No one spoke to him. But why do I see his face so clearly now? The fear and loneliness in his eyes. The faces of all the others I've forgotten. I was outraged at the injustice, the cruelty of the schoolyard taunts. I tried to intervene, but couldn't put the pack off his scent. I told the teacher, but can't recall if she did anything about it. And then he stopped coming to school. I can't remember how we learned a few weeks later that he died. I wish now I'd said a kind word to him, tried harder to protect him. I had my own strangenesses, though mine were mostly invisible. I wish I'd put my arm around his shoulder, asked him to eat his lunch with me. We could have watched together the screeching girls, their mad pursuit, and marveled at the vagaries of luck and circumstance that exalt some and cast down others, dealing out adoration and ridicule in unequal measure. We wouldn't have talked that way back then, of course. More likely, we would have sat in awkward silence or talked about what we wanted to become when we got older. Or maybe compared our cowlicks. I remember now how alike ours were, a cresting ocean wave on the right side of our foreheads, as though we'd been licked by the same thick-tongued cow, a calm old cow who saw all our fears and flaws and loved us just the same. And I'll close with another poem from No Day at the Beach. This poem is called Swifts. And in Portland, every fall, swifts migrate through the city, and they roost in this chimney at this middle school. And people come out by the hundreds to watch them, because in the evenings they swirl around as they feed, and it's quite extraordinary and quite a major event to witness. And so this is a poem in response to that. Swifts for my father. Early fall, the light thin and brittle, and if it's true that deprivation is a gift, I accept the gift. I walk down to Wallace Park to watch the swifts that roost every September in the Chapman School's tall brick chimney. The charming swifts with their long forked tails and swept back wings, 10,000 of them swerving and darting in the evening sky, a flowing, expandable spiral of birds, clearing the air of insects and riveting the wandering human mind. Tonight, there must be 300 spectators, a whole hillside of us, ordinary people whose wings fell off eons ago, who traded flight for speech and have regretted it ever since, sodden and earthbound as we are, except for our lifted eyes, our oohs and ahs that show we're still alive when the peregrine falcon dives in and knifes one out of the air, which we boo or cheer, sometimes simultaneously. We love this passion play of form and formlessness, the bird's shifting patterns flung out like a whiplash of water or school of fish above the stationary human school, then drawn tight together, a miracle they don't crash into each other, a miracle of echolocation until you see them as they truly are, a single organism, a body made mostly of air and quick decisions, jagged motions that gradually cohere, a poem, in other words. It takes the flock a full 20 minutes to funnel down into the chimney, and it seems a living smoke pulled back into a still and sleeping fire. So beautiful, I forget for a moment my father's death, or I turn my mind away from it, or no, I open my grief to accommodate this wonder and wonder what he might have thought of it were we standing here together, the kind of thing we never did and now will never do, except in my imagination, that unchanging inner sky where the swifts take flight whenever I want them to, and my father cannot die. So thank you very much.
Wow. Wow, that was beautiful. John, what a powerful poem to end on, too. A terrific reading from both of you. And I had forgotten, I mean, of course, Heather Sellers is a mutual friend. I guess we all have known Heather for probably many years. And we were lucky enough to have her also as a reader at the Dalí Poetry Series a couple years ago. So I look forward to having her again. She has a new book coming out, as I'm sure you both know.
Which is brilliant and amazing and astonishing.
Yeah. She is. And also her essays, right? Her personal essays. Well, before we start the Q&A, I wanted to just remind all of our viewers that you can get these wonderful books at tomballowbooks.com. Alsace Valentine will be very happy to help you get these books. She can send them to you. You can order them online. Alsace has been a wonderful support to us with the Dalí Poetry Series. So I hope all of you listening will go and buy the books by these two fabulous poets. So, this part of the program, we ask questions. We just sort of have a conversation about craft. It can be really whatever you want it to be. I can start us out, but I welcome you all asking each other questions. It's very free form. So, but again, first, thank you for those terrific readings. One thing I'm struck by in both of your readings, you are both so terrific in your use of metaphor and just strong imagery. And you've really mastered putting sort of the stuff of the world in your poems, and yet never limiting your poems to that. The poems always go beyond those concrete images and the metaphors. And could you both talk a little bit about the use of metaphor in your poems? One thing I'm struck by, this is kind of a related question, are your powerful endings, which often have a sort of turn or surprise in both of your works. And I'm wondering maybe if metaphor tends even more likely just to come later in the poems, or it feels to me like you weave them in. But could you talk a little bit about your use of imagery and metaphor in your writing process? Is this something as you start out, where you think you're going to explore, or are you surprised yourself by some of the things that surface in your writing process? Chelsea, let's start with you.
Sure. This is actually something I've been thinking a lot about lately, because I am, I was going to say I'm working on a new project. I'm not working on a new project. I'm trying to figure out sort of, as one does, I finished Still Life, and it's a book that it's a very personal book to me. It covers a lot of personal material. Yeah. And so for a while, I thought I had this idea of what I was going to do next. And I was working on these poems. They're Florida poems. They are mostly set in Florida. There's some about childhood, but I was doing some research into the kind of settling of Miami. Because my great. So my father's family goes back to the Miami pioneer days, like 1890s. And anyway, I was doing some, kind of really interesting to me historical research. But there came this point where I stepped back and I was like, I don't think this is actually of interest to anyone outside of me. And there were just problems coming up with this project as I had conceived it. So I was like, you know what? Some of this I think actually may be more interesting to deal with in nonfiction at some point, and I'm kind of tabling this aspect. So then, along the way, though, I've been writing poems, of course, writing. But I have this pile of drafts, and I'm not ready to send them to magazines. They have just been I'm feeling as though something is missing from them. And then I probably shouldn't be admitting any of this to an audience, right? But, oh well. But what is missing, what I feel like is missing is I have not quite settled on, for me, I tend to work with projects, larger projects in mind, kind of a larger arc of a book. And I haven't quite figured out sort of what are the questions that are pestering me. What are the deeper questions that are driving these poems? There's got to be something more, as John said a minute ago, sort of why am I haunted by this particular memory versus another? And so I've been trying to figure that out. I finally, a few weeks ago, I had a breakthrough. Thought, oh, I think I know what's guiding all of these, what's connecting these poems. And so now I'm thinking, I'm looking forward as soon as I can carve some time out. I'm really interested in going back and looking at this pile of drafts that I have, because when I have these larger questions, I do often insert metaphor. The larger metaphors come later for me. If I feel like obviously sometimes I'll write a poem and I know what it's about. I know sort of the surface story, and if there's something deeper, and I'm amplifying that with particular images, I know it from the moment that I start a poem, but very often I don't. Often I start poems and I'm just begin with observation and description, and maybe I have a funny story, and it can take quite a while for that deeper element, the metaphorical element, to present it to me. To give you just an example, my second book, which is called A Raft of Grief, I have a poem in it called The Talker. And basically it begins with a story of being in a restaurant in London when I was fresh out of college. I did the European, cram as many countries into 6 weeks as you can. Anyway, my boyfriend and I were in this London restaurant, and we just heard this absolutely obnoxious conversation happening at the next table. And it was very funny. And so I tried for probably 10 years to write the poem of this story of listening to this conversation. And I just, it felt like it never lifted off. I subsequently married that boyfriend and then divorced that boyfriend. And then one day, going through these drafts of poems that felt a little limp to me, I realized that what was really interesting about it was why were we able to eavesdrop on this conversation in the first place? Sure, the guy next to us was talking. He was really loud and obnoxious, but still, what suddenly interested me was this couple, who didn't have that much to say to each other, and therefore the conversation at the next table becomes more interesting, right? And once I had that, I was like, oh, this is what the poem is about. So sometimes it just takes me years, Some of my initial drafts very flat, and then they get more complex, more consciously as I go.
Yeah.
It was a very long answer, but I'm feeling my way through it, I suppose.
No, but that's so interesting, because I also kind of tuned into the question that John mentioned, that you said earlier on, that that you've got a poem and you're trying to figure something out. And but it's interesting to me that you're doing that at not only the individual poem level, but then also as you're approaching a manuscript, looking for that kind of structure, which I guess then almost becomes, maybe this word's a little too easy, but almost becomes sort of the thematic drive of the poem, I suppose. Those bigger questions. But no, that's interesting to hear how they both kind of work at both levels. John, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say about metaphor. It's so central to what poetry is on the most fundamental level. And I know for me, when I first started writing, that's what kind of lit me up the most, was metaphor, seeing the kind of hidden likeness in apparently dissimilar things, and the delight of that, seeing, oh, that thing is it's like that thing in this kind of uncanny way that you hadn't been aware of before. And I think something happens in our brains when that kind of connection gets made. And I think, metaphor is really kind of how we know the world, seeing things in relation to other things. I've always been really drawn to stunning, striking, surprising metaphors. And I would never, say that I try to get metaphors in my poems. I mean, they have to just kind of come, when they come, and it's wonderful when they do and when it feels right. But it's also, kind of working with metaphors or paying attention to metaphors in poems can shift, I think, the way we see the world, and can help us to look for those likenesses, for the ways in which things are alike, and especially when they're apparently quite different, and to see some underlying fundamental similarity or likeness is just deeply satisfying, I think. So, yeah.
I love that.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I was just like, can I just say, I mean, I was so knocked out by the lines in the poem about the birds, swifts. We described them as, one body. I just jotted the body of air and quick decisions. And then you said a poem, in other words.
Right.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And John, and what you were saying, it seems to me to be also speaking of relationships, and speaking about how we as people are looking for those similarities and those differences. And there's a real sort of corollary, I think, at the fundamental level of human relationships that I think is happening also.
It's a metaphor is a kind of resonance, and we all love the feeling of being in resonance.
Yeah. It is. I think it was Aristotle, right, who said that the essence of poetry is metaphor. So, but I'm interested. So with yours, you say, they come when they come. Do you find that they come typically in a later revision of a poem, or are you one who, in your early drafts, you're loose enough and you go where the words take you in a way that they take you into metaphor pretty easily and early? I'm curious.
Yeah, my poems all come out perfectly in the word. That's how everybody does it, right? That's actually how my teacher, Archie Ammons, Corson's Inlet, which you know is quite a famous poem, he wrote in a single sitting. Humbling. But no, I think that the metaphors, when they're any good, they kind of come spontaneously, and probably in the early work on a poem rather than later, but not always. I'm not sure I'd have to think about that more, kind of go through and sort of remember, when they occurred to me. But it's usually a spontaneous kind of connection that arises into awareness. Yeah.
And I think sometimes the most interesting ones, for me anyway, take me off guard. And I often used to tell my students to trust the subconscious, because it's going to throw up some strange things sometimes. And sometimes maybe especially as students, as early poets, we tend to want to dismiss some of it. It just feels a little too weird. And, you don't even know where that came from. But I don't know, in my opinion, sometimes the most interesting stuff happens that way. And I would encourage my students to hang on to that and see where it might take them if they would just dig a little bit more.
That's great advice. Yeah, that's really true. Yeah.
So another question I have, I noticed with both of your works, trying to think, I think the word is maybe, or the phrase, you have both a sort of endearing self-incrimination going on in many of your poems. And John, I have an earlier book of yours. I have the Sea of Faith book, and I saw so much of that in that book, especially. And I'm curious about that. I think it's so effective, and I'm wondering if you would both talk a little bit about that. I know, obviously, Chelsea, in the context of your book, The Still Life with Mother and Knife, it's often in your role as mother to your daughter. But anyway, can you talk a little bit about the role of self-incrimination and how you feel like that's working in your poems? I think for me, it's so powerful the way you're doing it, but it's not something that that all poets do, and you both do it well. So, could somebody talk about that?
I was gonna say, do I have to go first?
No, John, you want to
go? I'm happy to go first if you prefer. It's funny. I've never thought of it as self-incrimination. That sounds dangerous.
I know it does.
You're arrested for these things. I think, for whatever reason, my sense of humor tends to be self-deprecating, and I'm not sure why that is exactly. There's probably, some deeper, kind of psychological dynamic at work there. Maybe it's a kind of defense mechanism against real feelings of self-doubt or inferiority, or however you want to say it. That probably doesn't make really engaging poetry, but to work with a kind of more comic version of that self-deprecation maybe is a way of kind of coming at that sort of sideways, or letting off some of that energy, or containing some of that energy in a way that feels more workable or something. I'm not sure about that. I just find that, the human situation, and my particular version of the human situation, is just full of absurdities. It's just like, you just do ridiculous things, you think ridiculous things, and it's fun to write about those. This one Buddhist teacher, Chogyam Trungpa, said the spiritual life is just one insult after another. If you feel prideful or anything, the world will take you down a notch. So I just think it's fun. It feels fun to me to kind of poke fun at myself, and So
thank you. Yeah. I started my reading today with this poem about these really dark stories that my mother would tell, and they would laugh about them. Like, oh yeah, when you were born, I really wished that the cat would jump in your crib and suffocate you. Isn't that hilarious, right? And my aunt was like, oh, I didn't want to drown you myself, but I really hoped that I would just wake up one day and find the baby in the washing machine drowned. That would isn't that hilarious, right? So I was interviewed for a radio show a few months ago, and the host, we were talking about this, and the host was I think a little bit confused, maybe baffled by my joking about these stories. She said something like, "Well, do you and you and your mother get along now?" Or something. We have a great relationship, right? This is just, for one thing, I think I grew up in a family that had a pretty dark sense of humor. Then when I was working on my second book, as I mentioned earlier, it was a book that it begins at the end of a marriage, right? So it begins in divorce, and then my husband Jim likes to stress, I need to tell people there are two husbands in that book. There's a bad husband, there's a good husband. Midway through the book, he arrives, the kind of knight in shining armor. But when I was getting divorced, I was writing all of these, really, really vitriolic poems, really angry poems. And I was just trying to process, what went wrong. And I just totally, I ended up, I think a few of them I might have published here and there, but that I didn't put into the book ultimately. just because they were so one-sided, the just this angry. And what I realized eventually, is that there needed to be self-recrimination, just blaming, right? Blaming, an ex-spouse, or blaming the world, or blaming your parents, or blaming, it's just, it I think results in poetry that's very one note. And I think, one way of adding those layers of nuance, right, is like taking a hard look at oneself and think, okay, well, am I also to blame here? And so I think like John, my natural tendencies are towards self-deprecation. That is, that's who I am in the classroom. That's who I am on the page.
Yeah. Well, and it dawned on me as I was tuning into those parts of both of your poems, where you're doing that. And self-deprecating, of course, that's another way of looking at it. This is a much softer, lighter way. But it feels like it's also it connects you more, I think, to your reader. I mean, I think not that I'm not suggesting that you're doing it on purpose for that reason, but it feels as if it also is a doorway into audience, because we're all there. It's a way of sort of resisting the falling in ever to being too didactic or too pedantic. You're that sort of self-effacement connects you, I think, to your listeners or readers in I think a really effective way, whether it's done through humor or with a darker note. So I appreciate it. I think it's a wonderful technique that both of you use well, whether or not you're intending to do it for that reason. So
I think that's a great point. I find it very engaging, charming. I remember reading, I think it was at a letter Edgar Lee Masters, someone asked him if he ever thought about writing free verse, and he replied by saying, I write badly enough as it is. Trying to write free verse, and it just made me love him. I mean, at that point, I didn't think, I didn't have a strong feeling about him one way or another, but I thought, okay, this is a kind of guy. Doesn't take himself too seriously.
Yeah. Well, actually, my next question sort of follows up on that. You mentioned free verse. So it strikes me, especially with what you've read today, most of your poems for both of you are these wonderful narrative poems that then have these lyrical moments and leaps of metaphor within them. They're my favorite poems, not strictly lyric poems, not strictly narrative poems, but the combination of the two. You're both doing that so well. I guess I am curious if they all have a kind of, because your diction is so precise in both of your works, they have a sort of formal eloquence to them, even though from what I've read, I'm not seeing that you're necessarily working in any sort of traditional forms. I'm curious if you purposely stay away from that, or if it's something that you sometimes play around with. And maybe in some of your other books, you are doing that and I haven't seen it. But if you could talk a little bit about form, because I would argue there is still a sense of formality to your poems in some ways, at least some of them. Anyway, could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I know I've just read some wonderful sonnets that you've written, just saw on your website. They're really quite terrific. So do you want to go first this time?
Sure, I can. And I want to make sure too, I have a question that bounces off of this a little bit.
Good.
That was thinking about John mentioning, writing these skinnier poems, with all of the space. And I would also love to talk about that. Sort of how the line, which I mean, this is a function of, the larger idea of form, the way that the line lengths open up new possibilities for poems. So I am actually, quite formal. I do write a lot of, sonnets. Most of my poems are in blank verse. But what I'm going for it, and that is for non-poetry people, that is unrhymed iambic pentameter. Like there is I'd say a loose pentameter sort of as the heartbeat under my lines. And the reason I started writing, and it's not every single poem. I'm kind of flipping through this book right now. I mean, essentially, I sort of look at form as a tool. I mean, rhyme. Some of my poems rhyme. Often I will impose a stricter form when I'm working with kind of more chaotic subject matter, because I'm kind of playing with the tension between, trying to find some way of controlling that subject matter. And I think it just creates an interesting tension between like very, very, very dark, very chaotic subject that is then, confined as though the poet, needed these really strict controls, like to handle it, to deal with it. Like for example, I have a poem in Still Life that it describes being at a park, a local park, when I was in, I think, 4th grade, and with a friend, and we kind of came upon this man in the woods, and he chased us. And we got away. We were able to hop on our bikes and get away from him. But the poem is called Introduction to Statistics. I'm kind of considering, what might have been. And so I initially have my original notes for that poem. And my first drafts are terrible, but my initial notes are something like, it's just like 5 pages describing the park and describing the man. And eventually I hammered it into a Petrarchan sonnet, it's very rigorous, like that, that is, the Petrarchan sonnets are so hard.
Yeah.
But I needed that kind of constraint, that, just really holding this poem together. I mean, I have another poem about like this very specifically, very explicitly about postpartum depression. It's called Postpartum Lullaby. And I mean, that one is in a kind of sing-song rhyme. It opens, when 2:30, midnight 10, when the baby cries again, when at her breast a parasite, when she is up and down all night. And it goes on from there. And it has a little bit, people who've had children in the recent years, there's this Sandra Boynton, this children's book. She does these board books, really, really rhymey board book. And I don't think I was consciously channeling Sandra Boynton, but a friend of mine with small children read the poem and said, "Oh my gosh, this is like the specific Sandra. It has the rhythm of the specific Sandra Boynton book," which I was reading a lot at the time. So I suppose that's there. But I just, for me, I tend not to write free verse because I write badly enough as it is. Right? For me, having the rhythm, the pentameter line, the iambic, even if it's very faint, but having that there as I'm paying attention to that rhythm, it's like it distracts me enough that I can make more associative leaps in terms of the content. Mm-hmm. So that's how I started. I mean, I started experimenting with form when I was in graduate school, and my poems just got a lot better. I don't think necessarily technically, but my content became more interesting. Mm-hmm. And because I was distracting one part of my brain. Yep. So I've sort of done it ever since.
But probably allowing yourself to follow that auditory network that is set up, where surprises arise, right, because you were following something you didn't expect to be there. That's always, I think, thank you. That's
the poet Alicia Stallings, A.E. Stallings, she's written before about the dream logic of rhyme, right? Basically that, when you were writing a rhyming poem, and I don't exclusively rhyme by any means, but when you were writing a rhyming poem, you've come up with a word at the end of one line, and then you all of these unconscious associations come up.
Right.
Because you've got to find something that rhymes, and then how you can't go into it too determined,
right?
Where the poem is going to go, because the rhyme that presents itself might take you somewhere completely different. I love that idea.
I do too. It's a sort of template that's lit up inside. Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. Thank you, John.
Yeah, I just wanted to say about that. That seems like a really interesting activation of left brain, right brain functioning. So you've got these rules and structure. It's kind of left brain, but then you've got this dream logic and the unconscious and kind of the emotional life that's flowing into this. So I never thought of formal poetry in that way before, but I'm reading this wonderful book called The Master and His Emissary about the left hemisphere, right hemisphere. It's really brilliant work. I greatly admire poems in rhyme and meter, but I cannot write them myself. I feel like I don't have the skill or discipline to learn how to do that. And I don't feel called to do that in my own writing. And so, free verse forms are more, I shouldn't say more varied, but I mean, there's still ways to make the poem formally engaging. And, for me, that long, skinny form, for whatever reason, feels very compelling to me. And of course, part of the way poems are temporal experiences, they unfold in time, unlike paintings, which are, you see them all at once. And so the form really determines how we move through the temporal dimension of the poem. And so these short lines with lots of space, they move down the page rather than across the page in longer lines. So that's just an interesting way of configuring the experience of how you move through it. And then if you're constantly having to navigate line breaks, it slows you down a bit, and you're always a little bit off balance. And that can create a kind of heightened alertness, I think, if you engage with the poem, just to make sense of it. If the lines are broken that often, it requires a lot of kind of attention. Of course, all poems do, maybe just a different kind of attention. But yeah, that's the kind of form I'm most drawn to. But I do like the longer line, kind of more narrative poems as well. And every now and then I'll see, I've written an iambic line, and that's kind of wonderful. But I never do it, deliberately.
Yeah. Did you have another question with respect to John's shorter lines, Chelsea, that you wanted to ask?
Oh, well, I was just wondering, I think I had seen an interview with you where you had just started working in those shorter, skinnier lines. And I was wondering if you felt that the poems that you wrote, sort of how did the poems change? If you were moving, away from longer lines into this more open space, like did the poems shift tonally, or do they operate in different ways?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a kind of immediacy that comes from, it's not necessitated by the form, but for me anyway, there's more of an immediacy. I'd have to think about that. I could kind of invent an unsatisfying answer, but that's a really good question. The relationship between, what kinds of tones or even content are called forth by working in that particular form. And I'm not certain, but I do, for me, short poems, and those poems tend to be short, quick. I like the feeling of kind of getting into and out of a poem, as quickly as possible and still doing something interesting. I find that a pretty engaging challenge to not elaborate, to not proliferate, to just keep the poem simple, or complicated in simple ways or something. Yeah.
So John, if you don't mind, a follow-up to that then, in terms of your process of writing the short-lined poems, So does that mean that you actually sit down and from your early draft, write the short line, actually do your line breaks from the get-go, as opposed to longer lines that you then break into the shorter lines?
No, almost always I start with, just
That's
one or two or three lines on a poem, and then I know that the rest of the poem will follow in that form.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
The times I've written shorter poems, I've tended to do it the other way. I've written it out and then chopped it up.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I do that occasionally, but usually it starts that way. So it's kind of almost like having a pre-existing form to work with. Yeah.
so I know the poet David Kirby in Chelsea.
Mm-hmm.
I know you've been his student as well. He talks about how he feels that sometimes the shortest poems need the longest titles. So, which is kind of interesting. And if you look at some of his shorter poems, they do have these long titles. Of course, most of his poems tend to be long and rambling, but it's so funny. But I don't know. Have you experimented with long titles with your short poems, or not so much?
I haven't, but I know what he means. There's kind of a tradition in ancient Chinese poetry, like in the 12th month, following or arriving at the village, in evening, I saw.
Right. Then the poem's this
whatever. Yeah, and then the poem's like 4 lines.
Yeah.
But I've never done that myself, but maybe I will.
Yeah. Well, I guess we have to draw this to an end. I hate to do it. You guys have been terrific. Your poems are wonderful. We so appreciate your joining us for the Dalí Poetry Series. And also to those of you who've tuned in, thank you so much. Please buy their books. Alcé stands ready to help you do that. And also, Chelsea and John, when you find yourself in St. Pete next time, please let us know. You do have free admission into our museum, and we would love to have you come. But until then, all of you, please stay safe and strong, and we'll look forward to gathering again next month for the Dalí Poetry Series. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you.